In the scorching deserts of the Holy Land, where crosses met crescents and blood soaked the ancient stones of Jerusalem, there ruled a king unlike any the world had ever seen. His name was Baldwin IV, and history would remember him not for conquest or glory, but for something far more haunting. He was a monarch whose flesh rotted from his bones while he still drew breath, a sovereign who commanded armies while his body decomposed beneath royal robes, a ruler who sat upon the throne of God's chosen city as death consumed him cell by cell. This is the story of the Leper King, a young man who refused to surrender his crown even as his body surrendered to the most feared disease of the medieval world. The year was 1161, when Baldwin was born into the turbulent world of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. The son of King Amalric I and Princess Agnes of Courtenay, the infant prince entered a realm perpetually balanced on the knife's edge between survival and annihilation. Jerusalem, captured by Christian forces in 1099 during the First Crusade, had become the jewel of Outremer, the Latin Christian states carved from the lands of Islam. But this jewel was surrounded by enemies. To the north, south, and east, Muslim armies gathered strength under increasingly powerful leaders. The kingdom survived not through overwhelming force, but through diplomatic cunning, strategic marriages, and the desperate valor of its knights. Into this precarious world came a golden-haired child who would one day bear the weight of the entire Christian presence in the Holy Land upon shoulders that would eventually fail to bear even the weight of his own decaying flesh. Baldwin's childhood was that of any noble prince of his era. He trained in the arts of war, learning to wield sword and lance, to ride with the skill expected of a knight, to understand tactics and strategy. His tutors included William of Tyre, the kingdom's chancellor and greatest historian, a learned man who would later chronicle the boy's life with both admiration and heartbreak. The young prince showed promise. He was intelligent, quick to learn, and demonstrated the courage expected of royal blood. But as Baldwin approached his 9th year, William of Tyre began to notice something troubling. During playfighting with other children, the prince seemed strangely impervious to pain. When other boys pinched or scratched his arms, Baldwin did not flinch. At first, the tutor thought the child simply possessed extraordinary courage. The terrible truth would soon become impossible to ignore. William of Tyre conducted a simple test that would seal the young prince's fate. He took pins and pressed them into Baldwin's right arm and hand, watching carefully for the boy's reaction. Baldwin felt nothing. The skin did not register the punctures. The nerves transmitted no warning of damage. William's heart sank as he recognized the symptom that every person in medieval Christendom feared above all others. The loss of sensation was the harbinger, the first visible sign of a disease so dreaded that it could make lepers outcasts from society, condemned to live behind walls or wander with bells around their necks to warn others of their approach. The young prince, heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem, defender of the holiest city in Christendom, had contracted leprosy. William later wrote of this moment with barely concealed anguish, knowing that the bright, promising child before him was sentenced to a fate that many considered worse than death itself. Leprosy, known in medical terms as Hansen's disease, is caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, though this would not be discovered until the 19th century. In Baldwin's time, the disease was viewed through the lens of divine punishment, biblical curse, or moral corruption. The affliction attacks the peripheral nervous system, destroying nerve endings and leaving victims unable to feel pain in their extremities. Without pain to warn of injury, lepers would unknowingly damage their hands and feet, leading to infections, tissue death, and gradual loss of digits and limbs. The bacteria also attacks the skin, causing lesions, nodules, and the characteristic facial disfigurement that made lepers instantly recognizable and universally shunned. In severe cases, the infection could affect the eyes, leading to blindness. The disease progressed slowly but relentlessly, sometimes taking years or even decades to run its course. But the end was always the same. For a prince, for a future king, such a diagnosis should have meant immediate exclusion from the throne. But Baldwin IV would defy every expectation. When Baldwin's father, King Amalric, died in 1174, the 13-year-old leper prince ascended to the throne of Jerusalem. The coronation itself must have been a scene of profound contradiction. Here was a boy king, his face still smooth and unmarred by disease, crowned with all the sacred ceremony befitting God's anointed sovereign in the holy city. The crown of gold was placed upon his head, the scepter pressed into hands that could barely feel its weight. The Archbishop of Tyre blessed him, and the assembled nobles and clergy pledged their allegiance. But everyone present knew the secret that could not be spoken aloud during such a sacred moment. The new king was already dying. His body had already begun the slow process of destruction that would eventually reduce him to something barely recognizable as human. Yet there he stood, or rather there he sat upon the throne of Jerusalem, and for all the whispers and fears, he was their king. The law was clear. Baldwin IV was the legitimate heir, and until he died or could no longer rule, the throne was his. The young king faced immediate and overwhelming challenges. The greatest threat came from the south, where Saladin, the brilliant Kurdish general who had united Egypt and Syria under his command, was methodically tightening his grip around the Crusader states. Saladin was not merely a conqueror, but a strategist of rare genius, patient and calculating. He understood that the Crusader kingdoms survived through internal divisions among Muslim forces, and he had spent years eliminating those divisions. Now, with unprecedented power at his command, he turned his full attention to Jerusalem. For Baldwin, the situation was dire. The kingdom's military force was relatively small, perhaps 1,500 knights and a few thousand infantry. Against Saladin's vast armies, drawn from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, the Crusaders were perpetually outnumbered. The kingdom's survival depended on making Saladin's conquest too costly to be worth the effort, on exploiting any mistakes, on holding out until reinforcements could arrive from Europe. And now this impossible task fell to a 13-year-old boy whose body was already betraying him. In his first years as king, Baldwin demonstrated a maturity and strategic mind that shocked even his advisors. He understood that he could not lead from behind castle walls. Despite his disease, despite the stigma that should have rendered him untouchable, he rode at the head of his armies. The young king wrapped his disintegrating hands in cloth and leather, covered his developing lesions with robes and chainmail, and took up sword and lance like any knight. His presence on the battlefield served a purpose beyond mere symbolism. Medieval warfare relied heavily on morale and the personal charisma of leaders. Knights needed to see their king facing the same dangers they faced, needed to believe that their sovereign would not ask them to die for causes he himself would not fight for. Baldwin gave them that belief. Even as feeling left his arms, even as the first visible disfigurements began to appear on his face, he rode into battle. His soldiers, who should have been horrified by a leper in their midst, instead saw only courage. They saw a king who refused to surrender, and that refusal became infectious. But behind the armor and beneath the royal dignity, Baldwin's body was waging a war it could not win. The leprosy was progressing. By age 15, the king had lost most feeling in his hands and feet. His face began to swell and distort as nodules formed beneath the skin. The characteristic leonine facies of lepromatous leprosy was beginning to emerge, thickening his features and making his expression increasingly mask-like. His eyes, once bright with youth and intelligence, began to cloud as the disease attacked the delicate tissues. He could no longer fully close his eyelids, leaving his eyes perpetually dry and vulnerable to damage. His hands, which had once wielded sword and pen with equal facility, were becoming claws. The fingers were contracting, curling inward as tendons shortened and joints fused. Dark patches appeared on his skin where tissue was dying, turning black as blood flow ceased. The smell began around this time, the distinctive odor of necrotic flesh that would follow the king for the rest of his brief life. Yet even as his body failed, his mind remained sharp, clear, and fully aware of every indignity, every loss, every stage of his own disintegration. The Battle of Montgisard, fought on November 25th, 1177, would become Baldwin's defining moment, and the clearest demonstration that the Leper King was no mere figurehead. Saladin had invaded the kingdom with a massive army, perhaps 26,000 strong. The Muslim force was moving toward Jerusalem itself, devastating everything in its path. Baldwin, just 16 years old and already severely affected by leprosy, could muster only 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. Every military calculation suggested retreat, suggested waiting behind city walls for Saladin to tire of siege warfare. Instead, Baldwin ordered an attack. The decision seemed suicidal, the desperate gamble of a dying boy who had nothing to lose. But Baldwin had recognized something his more experienced advisors had missed. Saladin's army, confident of victory, had spread out to raid and pillage, becoming dangerously dispersed. The timing had to be perfect. On the day of battle, witnesses reported seeing the young king mounted on his war horse, his face already swollen with disease, his hands wrapped in cloth to hide the blackening fingers beneath. He could barely grip the reins. His face was incapable of showing emotion, frozen by nerve damage into a rigid mask. But he sat straight in the saddle, and when he gave the order to charge, his voice carried clearly across the assembled knights. The true cross, most sacred relic of Christendom, was carried before the army by the Bishop of Bethlehem, with the holy relic as their standard and their disintegrating king as their example of courage. The Crusader army crashed into Saladin's dispersed forces. The charge was devastating. Saladin's troops, caught off guard and separated from their main body, broke and ran. The rout became legendary. Of Saladin's 26,000 men, fewer than a tenth escaped. The Sultan himself barely avoided capture, fleeing on a racing camel. The Crusaders had achieved the impossible, and they had done it following a 16-year-old leper who could barely hold his sword. The victory at Montgisard should have been cause for unrestrained celebration. Jerusalem was saved, Saladin was humiliated, and the young leper king had proven himself a military commander of genuine skill. But the triumph came at a terrible personal cost. The exertion of battle, the stress and strain of commanding in combat, accelerated Baldwin's decline. Within weeks, those close to the king noticed the progression. His face was more swollen, the nodules more pronounced. The leonine features were becoming unmistakable. His hands, which had gripped sword and reins during the battle, were now almost completely numb, the fingers increasingly rigid. Dark patches of dead tissue spread across his skin. The smell of decay that had been faint now became constant, impossible to mask with perfumes or incense. Court physicians, helpless before a disease they did not understand and could not treat, could only watch and document his deterioration. Some suggested isolation, the traditional response to leprosy. Others whispered that perhaps the king should abdicate, should retire to a monastery where he could spend his remaining time in prayer and penance. Baldwin refused all such suggestions. He was king of Jerusalem, and until his last breath he would rule. The politics of the Crusader court grew increasingly treacherous as Baldwin's condition worsened. The kingdom needed stable succession, but Baldwin had no children, and given his disease and deteriorating condition, would never have any. The question of who would succeed him became the dominant issue at court. Various factions formed around potential heirs and regents. His sister Sibylla was married to Guy de Lusignan, a nobleman from France who many considered unsuited to the throne. Baldwin himself distrusted Guy intensely, seeing him as weak and politically inept. Yet Sibylla was the king's heir, and tradition suggested that her husband should become king if Baldwin died. The king's advisors were divided. Some supported Guy, others favored Raymond of Tripoli as regent. Still others pushed for the young Baldwin V, Sibylla's son from her first marriage. These political machinations swirled around the dying king like vultures circling carrion, each faction jockeying for position in anticipation of Baldwin's death, which everyone assumed would come soon. But the Leper king was not yet ready to die. As Baldwin entered his 20s, his physical state had become genuinely horrific. Contemporary accounts, while often tactful in their descriptions, cannot hide the reality of what the king had become. His hands were completely useless, the fingers blackened stumps curled into permanent claws. He could no longer hold a pen, could barely hold anything at all. Scribes had to write his dictation, and his seal was applied by others to documents he could not even touch. His face was grotesquely swollen, the features distorted by the characteristic nodules of lepromatous leprosy. The nose was particularly affected, the cartilage eroded away, leaving a collapsed ruin that made breathing difficult. His eyes, unable to close properly, were constantly inflamed and weeping. He was going blind, the world gradually fading into darkness. His skin was a patchwork of lesions, ulcers, and dead tissue. Where the circulation had failed completely, the flesh had turned black and begun to rot while he still lived. The smell was overwhelming, despite every effort to mask it with perfumes and aromatic oils. It was the smell of death, and it preceded the king wherever he went. Walking had become impossible. The disease had destroyed the nerves in his feet, and repeated unnoticed injuries had left them mangled and infected. By 1183, Baldwin could no longer stand without assistance, and even with help, the pain from damaged joints was excruciating. Ironically, while the disease had destroyed his ability to feel pain in his extremities, other parts of his body retained sensation, allowing him to experience the agony of infected wounds and deteriorating joints in his legs and spine. The king, who had charged into battle at Montgisard, now had to be carried everywhere on a litter. Even sitting upright for extended periods became difficult as his spine deteriorated. The royal throne was modified, propped with cushions and supports, to help the king maintain some semblance of dignity during audiences and court functions. But everyone who saw him knew the truth. The Leper King was rotting alive, decomposing while still breathing, his body a corpse that refused to die, while the mind within remained stubbornly, tragically alive. Yet even in this state, Baldwin continued to rule. He could not write, so he dictated. He could not walk, so he was carried. He could not see clearly, so others described what he needed to know. His mind, trapped in a disintegrating shell, remained sharp and focused. He presided over council meetings, made decisions about military strategy, negotiated with foreign ambassadors, and mediated disputes among his nobles. Contemporary sources speak with awe about his patience and wisdom during this period. Many expected him to become bitter or mad, to lash out in rage at the cruel fate that had befallen him. Instead, witnesses reported a king who seemed almost serene, who bore his suffering with a dignity that made even his enemies pause in respect. Saladin himself, learning of the young king's condition, reportedly expressed admiration for Baldwin's courage. This was the warrior who had defeated him at Montgisard, now reduced to a blind, rotting husk carried on a litter, yet still refusing to surrender his kingdom or his dignity. The breaking point came in 1183, when Baldwin, recognizing that he could no longer effectively lead armies in person, appointed Guy de Lusignan as regent and commander of the kingdom's forces. It was a position Baldwin granted reluctantly, driven by political necessity rather than confidence in Guy's abilities. That confidence proved to be well-founded in its absence. Later that year, Saladin invaded with a large force, besieging the fortress of Kerak during a royal wedding being held there. Guy assembled the kingdom's army, a substantial force that should have been able to confront Saladin's troops effectively. Instead, Guy hesitated. Day after day, he delayed, unwilling to engage the enemy, citing various strategic concerns that his fellow commanders saw as nothing more than cowardice. The wedding guests remained trapped in Kerak, while Guy's army sat paralyzed by indecision. News of this military farce reached Jerusalem, and King Baldwin's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Despite his blindness, despite his inability to walk, despite the fact that his body was visibly decomposing, the Leper King ordered himself carried at the head of a relief force to save Kerak himself. The sight of the king's litter arriving at the army's position must have been both inspiring and horrifying. Here came the King of Jerusalem, a man who should have been dead, who was, for all practical purposes, a living corpse, being carried into a war zone because his appointed regent lacked the courage to do what was necessary. Baldwin, unable to see the assembled troops, had their commanders brought to his litter so he could deliver his orders directly. His voice, though weakened by disease, was still clear enough to be heard. He stripped Guy de Lusignan of the regency on the spot, a devastating public humiliation. Then, from his litter, Baldwin commanded the army to march. The effect on the troops was electric. Shame at having needed their dying king to shame them into action, mixed with renewed determination. Saladin, learning that Baldwin himself was coming despite his condition, reportedly lifted the siege and withdrew. Whether this was due to strategic considerations or a kind of respect for his adversary's courage remains unclear. What is certain is that the Leper King, blind and rotting, had saved Kerak, where his healthy regent had failed. The Kerak incident proved to be one of Baldwin's last acts of dramatic intervention. The king returned to Jerusalem exhausted, and those closest to him knew the end was approaching. The journey had cost him dearly. His already minimal reserves of strength were depleted. The wounds and sores covering his body had worsened, many becoming infected from the rigors of travel. His breathing was increasingly labored as his nasal passages collapsed further. He could keep down only small amounts of food, and even water was sometimes difficult to swallow. Yet still his mind remained active. Still he insisted on being informed of all developments in the kingdom. Still he made decisions and gave orders. He had his nephew, the young Baldwin V, crowned as co-king, attempting to secure the succession and prevent the chaos he knew would follow his death. He continued to dictate letters and proclamations, though the effort of speaking for extended periods left him gasping. The royal court had become a macabre scene, nobles and clergy gathering around a king who was more corpse than man, taking orders from someone who should have been buried months or even years earlier. Baldwin's final days are not well documented, perhaps out of mercy to the dying king's dignity. What is known comes from fragments and hints in contemporary chronicles. He was moved to his chambers in the royal palace, no longer able even to be carried to the throne room. The windows were kept closed because sunlight hurt his damaged eyes. The room was heavy with the smell of incense and perfumes, desperate attempts to mask the stench of rotting flesh. Physicians came and went, able to do nothing but administer what comfort they could with herbal preparations and prayers. Priests attended him constantly, offering spiritual consolation as his body failed. He could no longer speak clearly, his words coming in gasps and whispers that had to be interpreted by those closest to him. His hands, those blackened claws that had once wielded a sword at Montgisard, lay motionless on the bed coverings. His face, swollen and distorted beyond recognition, showed no expression, but his mind remained present until nearly the end, aware of what was happening, conscious of his own gradual dissolution. Death came in March of 1185, when Baldwin IV was 24 years old. He had reigned for 11 years, longer than anyone had expected when he took the throne as a 13-year-old leper child. The official chronicles recorded his passing with suitable solemnity and respect, praising his courage, his wisdom, and his devotion to the kingdom. They were less forthcoming about the state of the body that was prepared for burial. Those who washed and wrapped the king's corpse for interment knew the full truth. The flesh had rotted from his face, leaving bone visible through the remnants of skin. His hands and feet were nearly skeletal, the fingers and toes mostly gone, eaten away by infection or simply rotted off. His torso was covered in suppurating wounds that had never healed. He had died piece by piece, and what remained for burial was barely recognizable as human. The servants who performed these final services did so with cloths wrapped around their faces, unable to bear the smell even in death. The king, who had ruled from a throne of gold, was prepared for a tomb of stone. Baldwin IV was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Christendom, built over what was believed to be the location of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. For a leper to be buried in such a sacred place was itself extraordinary. Medieval tradition held that lepers were cursed, their disease a sign of God's displeasure or punishment for sin. They were typically buried apart from the general population, often in unmarked graves. But Baldwin was king, and his suffering and courage had transformed him in the eyes of his people from a cursed leper into something approaching a martyr. The funeral was attended by nobles and clergy from across the kingdom. Chronicles record that many wept openly, not merely from conventional grief, but from genuine sorrow at the loss of a king who had held the kingdom together through force of will alone. The throne passed to his young nephew, Baldwin V, but the child king would die within a year, leading to the succession crisis Baldwin had tried so desperately to prevent. Within 2 years of the leper king's death, the political situation he had managed to contain would explode into disaster. Guy de Lusignan, despite Baldwin's opposition, eventually became king through his marriage to Queen Sibylla. He proved to be exactly as incompetent as Baldwin had feared. In 1187, just 2 years after the leper king's death, Guy led the kingdom's entire army into a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin's forces destroyed the Crusader army, captured Guy himself, and seized the True Cross. With no significant military force remaining to defend it, Jerusalem fell to Saladin in October 1187. The kingdom that Baldwin had held together through 11 years of determined resistance, ruling even as his body rotted around him, collapsed within months of his death. The loss of Jerusalem shocked Christian Europe and prompted the Third Crusade, bringing Richard the Lionheart to the Holy Land. But Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands for the next century. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, as Baldwin had known it, was finished. His struggles, his suffering, his desperate efforts to maintain the kingdom despite his disease had all been for a realm that would barely survive him. Yet even in defeat and loss, his legacy endured. Baldwin IV's story resonated through the centuries in ways that might have surprised him. Medieval chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, wrote of him with respect rarely accorded to enemy kings. William of Tyre's chronicle, completed shortly after Baldwin's death, presented the leper king as a figure of tragic nobility, a young man who bore unimaginable suffering with grace and courage. Muslim historians, including those close to Saladin, acknowledged Baldwin as a formidable adversary whose victory at Montgizard had been a devastating blow to their cause. Later generations found in Baldwin's story themes of perseverance against impossible odds, of duty transcending personal suffering, of leadership that manifested not in physical strength but in moral courage. The image of the young king, blind and rotting, being carried into battle on a litter became symbolic of absolute dedication to responsibility. Modern historians, examining the primary sources with more critical eyes, have debated the exact nature and progression of Baldwin's disease, the political machinations surrounding his reign, and the extent to which his legend exceeds historical reality. But none dispute the basic facts. A boy king with leprosy ruled Jerusalem for 11 years, led armies to victory, and held together a fragile kingdom until his body could no longer sustain him. The throne of Jerusalem itself became part of Baldwin's legend. According to tradition, the golden throne he sat upon, modified and cushioned to support his failing body, retained the smell of death long after his passing. Whether this was literal truth or metaphorical embellishment is impossible to determine, but the image is powerful, a seat of power marked forever by the suffering of the young king who refused to abandon it. Successive rulers who sat upon that throne would have been reminded of Baldwin IV, the Leper king, who had ruled from it even as his flesh decayed. The throne became a symbol of the price of leadership, of the suffering that duty might demand, of the mortality that awaits even kings. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the throne was likely destroyed or removed. But its symbolic power remained, kept alive through chronicles and legends. The story of the Golden Throne that bore the scent of a decomposing king became one of the defining images of the Crusader kingdom, a reminder of both its glory and its tragedy. Modern medical understanding allows us to reconstruct Baldwin's suffering with clinical precision that medieval chroniclers lacked. Leprosy, we now know, is not highly contagious and is caused by bacterial infection rather than divine curse. The disease Baldwin suffered from was likely the lepromatous form, the most severe variety characterized by widespread skin lesions and extensive nerve damage. The progression of his symptoms matches the clinical course of untreated lepromatous leprosy. The initial loss of sensation in his extremities, the development of facial nodules and leonine facies, the gradual loss of fingers and toes through repeated unnoticed injury, the collapse of the nasal cartilage, the development of corneal ulcers leading to blindness, all of these follow the expected pattern. The psychological burden of such a disease is difficult to imagine. Baldwin would have been conscious through all of it, fully aware as his body betrayed him piece by piece. He would have known what was coming at each stage, would have felt himself losing control of basic functions, would have experienced the horror of being trapped in a body that was actively destroying itself. That he maintained not only his sanity, but his competence as a ruler under these conditions suggests extraordinary mental resilience. The social and psychological aspects of Baldwin's experience extend beyond the physical suffering. Leprosy in medieval Europe and the Middle East carried not just medical, but profound social and religious significance. Lepers were considered unclean, their touch potentially contaminating, their presence in normal society prohibited. The fact that Baldwin was king protected him from the worst of this stigma, but it could not have prevented him from being aware of it. He knew how lepers were treated, knew that under ordinary circumstances his disease would have made him an outcast. He would have seen the discomfort in people's eyes, noticed the subtle withdrawal, even from those who professed loyalty, felt the isolation that came from being both king and leper. His subjects respected him, even revered him for his courage, but they could not have helped their visceral reactions to his appearance and smell. The king was surrounded by people yet utterly alone in his suffering. No one else could truly understand what he endured. No one else experienced the daily indignity of a body that refused to obey, of flesh that rotted while consciousness remained. Baldwin's courage was not just in facing external enemies, but in facing each day trapped in a body that was his own tomb. The religious dimension of Baldwin's story adds another layer of complexity. Medieval Christianity saw suffering as potentially redemptive, a way to share in Christ's passion and earn spiritual merit. Did Baldwin view his disease in these terms? Some chronicles suggest he accepted his affliction as God's will, bearing it with Christian resignation. Others hint at a more complicated relationship with his fate. He continued to rule aggressively, to seek military victory, to pursue political objectives with determination. This suggests a man who, whatever his private spiritual struggles, was not content to be merely a suffering martyr. He wanted to accomplish something with the time he had left. His faith likely gave him comfort and strength, but it did not make him passive. The leper king was devout, but not defeated. He prayed, but also acted. He accepted God's will regarding his disease, but not regarding his kingdom. This combination of acceptance and determination, of faith and action, made him a figure who transcended simple categorization. He was neither a saint nor simply a tragic victim, but something more complex and more human. The question of what might have been haunts Baldwin's story. He died at 24, having reigned for only 11 years. What could he have achieved with more time, with a healthy body? His military acumen was proven at Montgisard and in subsequent campaigns. His political judgment, while not perfect, showed sophistication beyond his years. He managed to maintain a balance between competing factions at court, to navigate the treacherous waters of Crusader politics with considerable skill. Had he lived to middle age in good health, might he have been remembered as one of the great medieval kings? Could he have found a way to permanently secure the kingdom, to achieve a lasting peace or a decisive victory? These questions are unanswerable, but inevitable. The tragedy of Baldwin IV is not just that he suffered and died young, but that his potential was never fully realized. We see glimpses of what he might have become in his brief moments of triumph, in the respect even his enemies accorded him. But the full picture remains forever incomplete, cut short by a disease that killed him slowly while the world watched. The legacy of Baldwin IV extends into unexpected realms. His story has inspired numerous works of historical fiction, appearing in novels and films about the Crusades. The 2005 film Kingdom of Heaven featured Baldwin as a character, presenting him as a voice of reason and tolerance in a time of religious conflict. While the historical accuracy of such portrayals is debatable, they reflect the enduring fascination with the leper king. He represents something that resonates across centuries, the triumph of will over circumstance, of duty over suffering, of courage over despair. Modern audiences, far removed from the medieval world of crusades and chivalry, still respond to the basic human story of a young man who refused to surrender to a terrible fate. The specific historical context matters less than the universal themes. Suffering, mortality, duty, courage, these are experiences and virtues that transcend time and culture. Baldwin's story speaks to these fundamental aspects of human existence in ways that pure military or political history cannot. Medical historians have found in Baldwin's case a valuable example of disease's impact on political history. The course of the Crusader kingdom might have been drastically different had Baldwin not contracted leprosy. A healthy king could have produced heirs, ensuring stable succession. He could have led armies personally throughout his reign, rather than just in his early years. He might have consolidated power more effectively, prevented the factionalism that tore the kingdom apart after his death. The succession crisis that followed Baldwin's death was directly related to his disease. Because he could not marry and father children, the throne passed through his sister, leading to Guy de Lusignan's disastrous reign. One bacterium, invisible to medieval eyes, shaped the destiny of a kingdom and perhaps the course of Christian-Muslim relations in the Holy Land. This intersection of biology and history, of microscopic pathogens and macroscopic political events, illustrates how fragile historical causation can be. Great events turn on small factors, and the fate of nations can hinge on the health of individuals. The comparison between Baldwin and other historical figures who ruled despite disability or disease is instructive. History offers numerous examples of leaders who overcame physical limitations. Franklin Roosevelt leading the United States from a wheelchair, Lord Byron commanding troops despite a clubfoot, Julius Caesar reportedly suffering from epilepsy. But few faced challenges as severe and progressive as Baldwin's. His disease was not a static disability, but a gradually worsening condition that eventually made him entirely dependent on others for basic functions. That he continued to rule effectively until near the end of his life is remarkable. Most leaders faced with such circumstances would have abdicated or been forced from power by nobles uncomfortable with a visibly diseased monarch. Baldwin's ability to maintain his throne despite his condition speaks to both his personal strength and the unique circumstances of his reign. The kingdom needed a legitimate king, and Baldwin was that king. His illness, while horrifying, was less dangerous to the kingdom's stability than a succession crisis or civil war. So he ruled, and his subjects accepted his rule, creating one of history's most unusual arrangements of power. The psychological profile of Baldwin IV, reconstructed from historical sources, reveals a personality of unusual complexity. He was clearly intelligent and perceptive, able to read political situations and make strategic decisions, even when he could no longer read physical documents unaided. He possessed remarkable self-control, maintaining composure and dignity even under extreme physical duress. But he was also human, subject to anger and frustration. His public humiliation of Guy de Lusignan after the Carac incident showed that he could be ruthless when he felt his trust had been betrayed. He was proud, as evidenced by his refusal to abdicate or retire despite his condition. Whether this pride was a vice or a virtue is debatable. It kept him on the throne, which arguably served the kingdom's interests, but it also meant he experienced suffering that he might have avoided had he been willing to surrender power. His religious faith was clearly important to him, yet he was no passive mystic. He was an active, engaged ruler who happened to be dying slowly and horribly, not a saint transcending earthly concerns. The economic and military dimensions of Baldwin's reign have sometimes been overshadowed by focus on his disease, but they are worth examining. The Crusader kingdom's economy was precarious, dependent on pilgrimage traffic, Italian merchant support, and tribute from Muslim territories. Baldwin managed to maintain this economic system despite the constant threat of war. His military strategy was largely defensive, recognizing that the kingdom lacked the resources for sustained offensive operations. He chose his battles carefully, avoiding confrontations that might devastate his limited forces, while striking hard when opportunity presented itself. Montgisard was a calculated risk that paid off spectacularly, but Baldwin did not try to repeat it, understanding that such victories were exceptions rather than foundations for strategy. His approach might be characterized as strategic patience, holding territory, maintaining alliances, and waiting for Saladin to make mistakes. It was not a glorious strategy, but it was a realistic one given the kingdom's limitations. That he could execute this strategy while his body disintegrated is another testament to his mental discipline. The court physicians who attended Baldwin throughout his reign left few records of their treatments, but we can infer their approaches from medieval medical practice. Leprosy was treated, to the extent it was treated at all, with a variety of herbs, minerals, and animal derivatives. Patients might be given preparations containing mercury, arsenic, or other toxic substances that did more harm than good. They might be bled regularly, a common treatment that would have further weakened an already compromised body. Prayers and relics were also employed, with the sick hoping for miraculous cures. Baldwin undoubtedly underwent all of these treatments, none of which would have slowed his disease's progression in the slightest. The frustration of the royal physicians, watching their patient and king deteriorate despite their best efforts, must have been profound. They would have known they were failing, that all their learning and skill were useless against this disease. Yet they had to maintain a facade of professional confidence, had to seem to be doing something. The psychological burden on the medical staff, watching a young king rot alive while unable to help him, was its own form of suffering. The relationship between Baldwin and Saladin, though primarily one of enemies, had elements of mutual respect that transcended religious and political divisions. Saladin was aware of Baldwin's condition and his courage. According to some sources, he privately expressed admiration for the young king's determination. This did not stop him from prosecuting war against the Crusader kingdom, but it may have influenced his tactics. Saladin knew that Baldwin could not live much longer, that time was on the Muslim side. This encouraged a patient, long-term strategy rather than all-out assault. He could afford to wait, to probe for weaknesses, to let the Leper King's inevitable death solve what military force might not. After Baldwin's death and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem, Saladin treated the city's Christian inhabitants with notable mercy, allowing safe conduct to those who wished to leave. Was this influenced in part by memory of his worthy adversary? We cannot know, but the question is intriguing. The mutual respect between these two adversaries, Christian and Muslim, represents a moment of chivalric honor in a conflict often marked by atrocity and brutality. The servants and attendants who cared for Baldwin during his final years remain largely anonymous in the historical record, yet their role was crucial. Someone had to feed him when he could no longer hold utensils. Someone had to clean his wounds and change his dressings. Someone had to help him with the most basic and undignified bodily functions. Medieval attitudes toward lepers suggest that such service would have been considered both dangerous and degrading. Yet these servants stayed, whether out of loyalty, duty, or lack of choice. They bathed a king whose body was rotting, dressed wounds that would never heal, stood in rooms filled with the stench of necrotic flesh. They maintained the fiction of royal dignity, even when the reality was a young man reduced to near-complete physical helplessness. Their patience and dedication made it possible for Baldwin to continue ruling. Without them, he would have been forced to abdicate much earlier, unable to maintain even the appearance of functioning authority. They were the invisible support system that allowed the Leper King to remain king until death finally released him. The moment of Baldwin's death, though not extensively documented, can be imagined with painful clarity. He would have known it was coming, would have felt his body finally giving up its stubborn grip on life. Perhaps there was relief mixed with whatever other emotions he felt. The long struggle was ending. The pain and indignity would soon be over. But there must also have been regret. He was 24, an age when most men are just beginning their prime. He had been king for more than a decade, but had experienced almost none of the normal pleasures of life. Love, marriage, children, the simple joy of a healthy body, all had been denied him. His reign had been a series of crises managed and disasters averted, punctuated by brief moments of triumph. Now it was ending, and the kingdom he had fought so hard to preserve was already showing signs of the collapse that would follow his death. He could do nothing more. His will had finally met its match in physical impossibility. When his last breath came, it must have been both a tragedy and a mercy. The immediate aftermath of Baldwin's death saw the brief reign of his nephew Baldwin V, a sickly child who died before his 9th birthday. With the child king's death, the succession crisis Baldwin had tried to prevent finally erupted. Sibylla claimed the throne and crowned her husband Guy as king. The kingdom's nobles split, some supporting Guy, while others backed Raymond of Tripoli. This internal division fatally weakened the Crusader state, just as Saladin was preparing his final offensive. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 was the direct result of Guy's incompetent leadership, the very incompetence Baldwin had recognized and tried to prevent from having strategic consequences. The fall of Jerusalem that followed was the culmination of political failures that the Leper King had held at bay through sheer force of will. In death, Baldwin could no longer protect the kingdom from itself. The careful balance he had maintained between competing factions collapsed without him. His fears about the succession had been entirely justified. The kingdom needed what he had provided: strong, undisputed leadership. Without him, it fell apart. The rediscovery of Baldwin's story by modern audiences has been facilitated by both scholarly work and popular culture. Academic historians have examined the chronicles and documents of the period, producing detailed studies of his reign and its context. Meanwhile, novels and films have brought Baldwin to a wider audience, though often with varying degrees of historical accuracy. The 2005 film Kingdom of Heaven, directed by Ridley Scott, featured a particularly memorable portrayal of Baldwin, depicting him as a masked king whose hidden disease symbolized both his physical suffering and his political isolation. While the film took liberties with historical facts, it captured something essential about Baldwin's story: the image of the hidden king, the ruler whose true condition was both known and unspoken, the power wielded from behind barriers of cloth and ceremony. This version of Baldwin resonated with modern audiences in ways that pure historical accounts might not, proving that his story still has the power to move people nearly a millennium after his death. The moral and philosophical questions raised by Baldwin's story remain relevant. What do we owe to duty, and when does that duty become destructive to the self? Should Baldwin have abdicated earlier, sparing himself years of suffering, or would that have been a betrayal of his responsibilities to his kingdom and subjects? Was his determination to rule until the end an act of heroism or of pride? Different ethical frameworks provide different answers. From a utilitarian perspective, one might argue that Baldwin's continued rule served the greater good by maintaining stability. From a perspective focused on individual well-being, one might argue that no duty is worth such suffering. Medieval Christian ethics would likely have praised his suffering as redemptive. Modern secular ethics might question whether martyrdom serves any real purpose. There are no easy answers, which is perhaps why Baldwin's story continues to provoke thought and discussion. He forces us to confront questions about duty, suffering, and mortality that we would prefer to avoid. His life was a test case in the ethics of responsibility, played out with the highest possible stakes. The cultural impact of leprosy itself deserves attention in the context of Baldwin's story. The disease, now largely controlled through modern antibiotics, was one of the most feared afflictions of the medieval world. Biblical references to lepers as unclean reinforced social ostracism. The visible disfigurement caused by the disease made victims instantly recognizable and universally shunned. Lepers were forced to live in segregated communities, often called Lazar houses after Lazarus, the biblical leper. They were required to announce their presence by ringing bells or calling out warnings. Their touch was considered contaminating, their presence polluting. This social death was in many ways worse than the physical disease itself. Baldwin, by virtue of his royal status, was spared the worst of this social stigma, but he could not have been unaware of it. He knew what his disease meant in the eyes of society. The fact that he could transcend this stigma through force of personality and the legitimacy of his position makes his achievement even more remarkable. He transformed himself from potential outcast into revered king, not by hiding his disease, but by making others see past it to the man and leader beneath. The architectural legacy of Baldwin's reign is modest but significant. Jerusalem's defenses were maintained and improved during his rule. Churches and public buildings were constructed or renovated, but the most poignant architectural connection to Baldwin is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself, where he was buried. This building, marking what Christians believe to be the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, had been extensively rebuilt by the Crusaders. Baldwin worshipped there throughout his reign, and it was there that he was finally laid to rest. The church survived the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, protected by Saladin's orders. It stands today, still marking the spot, though Baldwin's exact burial location has been lost to time and subsequent renovations. Pilgrims who visit the church today walk over ground where the leper king once knelt in prayer, their feet passing unknowingly over his unmarked grave. The building links past and present, providing physical continuity between the medieval world of crusaders and lepers and our own very different time. The question of Baldwin's inner life, his private thoughts and feelings, is one that historical sources can only hint at. He left no diary or personal correspondence that survived, The chronicles that document his reign focus on public events and actions rather than private psychology. But we can make some reasonable inferences. He must have experienced fear, particularly in the early stages of his disease, when he understood what was coming but had not yet experienced the full horror. He must have felt anger at the unfairness of his fate, being struck by such a disease at such a young age. He likely experienced periods of depression and despair, moments when the burden seemed too heavy to bear. But he must also have found sources of strength. His faith provided comfort. His sense of duty gave meaning to his suffering. The respect and loyalty of his subjects offered validation that his efforts mattered. The small victories and successful defenses of the kingdom gave him satisfaction. He was not simply enduring but achieving, not merely surviving but ruling. This sense of purpose may have been what allowed him to continue when purely physical considerations should have led him to surrender. The tactical and strategic lessons of Baldwin's military campaigns have been studied by military historians. His victory at Montgisard demonstrated the value of aggressive action at the right moment, even when outnumbered. His general defensive strategy showed understanding of resource limitations and strategic patience. His recognition that different commanders required different approaches, his willingness to remove incompetent subordinates, even when politically costly, his ability to read battlefield situations and make decisions quickly despite his physical limitations. All of these demonstrated military acumen that would have been impressive in any commander, let alone one suffering from advanced leprosy. Modern military academies sometimes examine Baldwin's campaigns as examples of leadership under adverse conditions. The Leper King understood that morale and perception could matter as much as numbers and supplies. His presence on the battlefield, however physically compromised, sent a message that inspired his troops and intimidated his enemies. Leadership, he demonstrated, was not primarily about physical prowess, but about will, judgment, and the ability to inspire others to follow. The technological and medical context of Baldwin's era is important for understanding the full horror of his situation. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacterial infection or immune response. The concept of contagion was vague and often wrong. Physicians could describe symptoms but not explain causes. They could observe disease progression but not halt it. For someone suffering from leprosy, there was no hope of cure, no possibility of treatment beyond symptom management, no scientific understanding that might offer comfort even if physical relief was impossible. Baldwin died without ever knowing what had caused his disease or why his body was destroying itself. This existential uncertainty, the inability to even understand what was happening to him in medical terms, added another layer to his suffering. Modern patients with serious diseases can at least comprehend their conditions, can understand the biological processes at work. Baldwin had no such knowledge. He only knew that something was terribly wrong and that it would only get worse. The mystery of his own body's betrayal must have been as troubling as the physical symptoms themselves. The comparison between Baldwin's suffering and that of other lepers of his era highlights the king's unique position. While he endured all the physical horrors of the disease, he was spared the social death that ordinary lepers experienced. He remained part of society, maintained his status and role, continued to interact with others in ways that common lepers could not. But this created its own burden. Other lepers could retreat from society, could accept their status as outcasts, and find community with fellow sufferers. Baldwin had no such option. He had to maintain royal dignity, had to appear in public, had to endure the stares and barely concealed revulsion of those around him. He could not hide, could not withdraw, could not allow his suffering to interfere with his duties. In some ways, this made his burden heavier than that of common lepers. They could surrender to their fate. He could not. Every public appearance was a performance. every council meeting a test of endurance, every military campaign a battle not just against external enemies, but against his own failing body. The isolation of leadership was compounded by the isolation of disease, creating a loneliness that few could comprehend. The symbolic significance of a leper king extends beyond Baldwin's individual story to broader themes in medieval culture and religion. Leprosy was often viewed as a physical manifestation of spiritual corruption, a mark of God's judgment. Yet here was a king, God's anointed, suffering from this cursed disease. This created a theological paradox that medieval thinkers struggled to explain. Some suggested that Baldwin's suffering was a test of faith, like Job's trials. Others proposed that it was redemptive suffering, sharing in Christ's passion. Still others quietly wondered if it indicated divine displeasure with the Crusades themselves. Baldwin's existence challenged conventional understanding of the relationship between physical condition and spiritual state. He was simultaneously the highest sacred authority in the kingdom and a disease-ridden body that traditional theology viewed as unclean. This paradox was never satisfactorily resolved. It simply existed, forcing everyone who encountered Baldwin to confront the inadequacy of their categories and explanations. The Leper King was an anomaly that broke theological and social frameworks. The daily routine of Baldwin's life during his final years would have been carefully structured to maximize his remaining capabilities while managing his deteriorating condition. He would have awakened early, assisted from his bed by servants who had to be careful not to damage his fragile skin. Morning prayers would have been followed by a simple breakfast, perhaps porridge or bread softened with wine, foods easy to consume with minimal chewing. The morning hours, when his energy was highest, would have been devoted to the most important business, meeting with advisors, hearing reports, making decisions. By midday, exhaustion would have set in, necessitating rest. Afternoons might bring more meetings or dictation of correspondence. Evenings were for lighter matters, perhaps listening to music or having chronicles read aloud. Throughout the day, servants would have attended to his wounds, changing dressings, applying what medications they had. The routine was simultaneously that of an invalid and a monarch, mundane bodily care mixed with affairs of state. This dual existence, managing both a dying body and a troubled kingdom, was Baldwin's reality for years. The historiography of Baldwin IV, the way historians have written about him over the centuries, reveals changing attitudes and interpretations. Medieval chroniclers presented him primarily as a figure of admirable courage, emphasizing his military achievements and pious suffering. Later historians, influenced by Enlightenment rationalism, were more clinical, focusing on the political and military facts of his reign while viewing his disease as unfortunate but somewhat incidental. Romantic historians of the 19th century rediscovered Baldwin's story and made him a symbol of tragic heroism, emphasizing the pathos of his situation. Modern historians have attempted more nuanced assessments, examining the complex interaction between his disease and his political effectiveness, questioning whether his determination to rule served the kingdom's long-term interests, analyzing the succession crisis that his disease indirectly caused. Each era has found in Baldwin's story elements that resonated with its own concerns and values. He has been variously portrayed as tragic hero, religious martyr, cautionary tale, and exemplar of leadership. All of these interpretations capture something true about his life, but none captures the full complexity of the man. The counterfactual question of what would have happened had Baldwin never contracted leprosy is irresistible to consider. A healthy Baldwin IV might have been one of the great Crusader kings. He could have married, producing heirs and securing the succession. He could have led armies personally throughout his reign, rather than only in his early years. His victory at Montgisard might have been followed by other triumphs. He might have forged a lasting peace with Saladin or achieved a decisive military victory. The Crusader kingdom might have survived decades or even centuries longer. Jerusalem might still be a Christian city. The course of religious and cultural history in the Middle East might have been fundamentally different. Of course, all of this is speculation. We cannot know what a healthy Baldwin would have achieved, but the question is worth considering because it highlights how contingent historical events are on factors like disease and mortality. The presence or absence of a single bacterium in a single individual's body potentially changed the religious and political map of the Mediterranean world. History is shaped by impersonal forces like economics and ideology, but it is also shaped by deeply personal factors like individual health and longevity. The final assessment of Baldwin IV must acknowledge both his achievements and his limitations. He held together a fragile kingdom for 11 years under impossible circumstances. He demonstrated courage, wisdom and determination that impressed even his enemies. He won at least one significant military victory and managed to avoid catastrophic defeat throughout his reign. He provided stable leadership during a critical period in the Crusades. These are real accomplishments that justify the respect accorded to him by contemporary chroniclers and later historians. But he also failed in important ways. He could not secure the succession, despite knowing this was crucial. His distrust of Guy de Lusignan was justified, but he could not prevent Guy from eventually becoming king. The political arrangements he made proved inadequate to survive his death. The kingdom collapsed within years of his passing. Whether a healthy king could have avoided these failures is unknowable. What is certain is that Baldwin IV did the best he could with the time and circumstances given to him. He ruled as well as any man could have ruled under such conditions. That his best efforts were ultimately insufficient to save the kingdom does not diminish their value. He fought against impossible odds and lost, but he fought with everything he had. In the end, that may be all we can ask of anyone. The throne of Jerusalem, that golden seat marked forever by the scent of a decomposing king, serves as the perfect symbol for Baldwin's legacy. It represents power and suffering in equal measure, authority and mortality inseparable. Every king who sat upon it after Baldwin would have been reminded that kingship is not just glory and conquest, but also sacrifice and endurance. The throne that bore the scent of death was a memento mori in the literal sense, a reminder of death at the very seat of power. It represented the price of leadership, the burden of responsibility, the inevitability of decay. When Baldwin sat upon that throne, unable to feel its surface beneath his numb flesh, partially blind and barely able to move, issuing orders that would send men to war or establish policies that would affect thousands of lives, he embodied a truth that all rulers must eventually face. Power is temporary. The body fails, and death comes for kings and peasants alike. The difference is only in how we choose to spend the time we have. Baldwin chose to spend his ruling, leading, fighting, until his body could no longer support even those basic functions. The throne carried his scent long after he was gone, a ghostly presence haunting the seat of power, reminding all who followed that kingship could demand everything, even flesh and bone, even life itself. In the centuries since his death, Baldwin IV has become more than a historical figure. He has become a symbol, an archetype, a story that speaks to fundamental human experiences. We may never face leprosy in our lives, but we all face mortality. We all confront our own physical limitations and eventual decline. We all must decide how we will bear suffering when it comes. Baldwin's story offers no easy answers to these questions, but it offers an example of one way to face them, with determination, with dignity, with refusal to surrender, even when all seems lost. His life was short, his suffering immense, his ultimate failure to save his kingdom complete. Yet his story endures because it demonstrates something essential about human resilience and courage. The leper king rotted alive on the throne of Jerusalem, but he remained king until the end. His flesh betrayed him, but his will did not. His body became a horror, but his spirit remained unbroken. In an age that often seems obsessed with physical perfection and comfort, there is something profound in remembering the young king whose rotting body housed an indomitable will. Baldwin IV reminds us that we are more than our bodies, that character and courage can transcend even the most terrible physical suffering, and that sometimes the greatest victories are simply refusing to surrender in the face of impossible odds. The story ends where it began, in the scorching deserts of the Holy Land, in the ancient city of Jerusalem, where crosses met crescents and blood soaked the stones. The leper king is gone, dead at 24, buried beneath the church of the Holy Sepulchre in ground that would soon fall to Saladin's armies. The kingdom he fought to preserve collapsed shortly after his death. The throne that bore his scent was destroyed or lost when Jerusalem fell. The crusading dream that brought his ancestors to the Holy Land would fade over the following century. In purely political and military terms, Baldwin IV's reign was ultimately a failure, a temporary holding action that delayed but could not prevent disaster. Yet his story survived the fall of Jerusalem, survived the end of the Crusades, survived the medieval world that created him. It survived because it speaks to something that transcends politics and warfare, something that touches the core of what it means to be human. Baldwin IV, the leper king who rotted alive on the throne, reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear or suffering, but the determination to continue despite them. He reminds us that duty sometimes demands everything we have and more. He reminds us that mortality comes for all of us, but how we face it defines who we are. His body decayed, his kingdom fell, his name faded from common memory. But in the chronicles, in the histories, in the stories told across centuries, the leper king endures. Not as he died, blind and rotting and helpless, but as he lived, unbowed, determined, refusing to surrender even as his body surrendered around him. That image, that example, is his true legacy, more lasting than any crown or kingdom. The king who ruled while decomposing before the world left us a final lesson written in flesh and bone and iron will. It is not how long we live that matters, but how we choose to live the time we have.